April 10, 1912. If you stood on the docks of Southampton that morning, you didn't see a ship. You saw a steel mountain blocking of the sun. It was the largest moving object ever built by human hands, 882 feet long, 46,000 tons, a monument to the arrogance of the Edwardian era. They believed they had conquered nature with steam and iron. They named her Titanic, after the titans of mythology who dared to challenge the gods. They forgot that the titans lost. Inside, she wasn't a ship. She was a floating Versailles. For the wealthy elite in first class, the ocean didn't exist. They were insulated from reality by walls of mahogany and gold. Tickets cost the equivalent of $100,000 today. For that price, you got electric elevators, a heated swimming pool, and a Turkish bath. It was a world of absolute comfort. But below the waterline, there was a different world. Third class. Immigrants. Dreamers. They packed their entire lives into suitcases, hoping for a new start in America. They didn't know it yet, but they were trapped in a steel cage. The public saw the glamour, but the ship had a dirty secret. Before the Titanic even left the harbor, a fire was burning deep inside her belly. A spontaneous combustion in coal bunker number 6. It burned for days, reaching temperatures of 1,000 degrees. It weakened the steel hull, right where the iceberg would later strike. The owners knew. The captain knew. But money mattered more than safety. They simply kept shoveling coal, hoping the fire would die out before disaster struck. At noon, the whistles blew. The giant began to move. But almost immediately, there was an omen. As the massive Titanic moved, her sheer power sucked a smaller ship, the SS New York, towards her. The ropes snapped like thread. They missed colliding by just 4 feet. It was a warning from the ocean, a warning they ignored. As the coast of England faded into the mist, the Titanic turned her bow toward the Atlantic and toward the night.
Sunday, April 14th, 11:30 p.m.
The Atlantic Ocean was dangerously calm. No waves breaking against the ice meant no white foam to spot in the dark. It was pitch black. No moon. High above the deck, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were staring into the void. They were freezing, and they had a fatal problem. The binoculars were missing. Locked in a cabinet, the key left behind in Southampton. They were flying blind at 22 knots into an ice field. 11:39 p.m. Fleet rings the bell. He picks up the phone. 3 words that sealed history. "Iceberg, right ahead!" First Officer Murdoch ordered a hard turn. The engines were thrown into reverse. But a ship this big doesn't turn like a car. It slides. 37 seconds later, contact. It wasn't a crash. It was a scrape. A fatal kiss. The ice didn't slice the steel open like a knife. It was more subtle. It popped the iron rivets, unzipping the hull plates below the waterline. Up on the decks, barely anyone noticed. A slight shudder, a rattle of silverware. That was all. Passengers went out on deck and saw chunks of ice. They laughed. They played soccer with the ice. They asked the crew if the bar was still open. Why panic? They were on the Titanic. God himself couldn't sink this ship. But deep below, the reality was drowning the dream. Thomas Andrews, the ship's architect, did the math. Titanic could float with 4 compartments flooded, but the ice had opened 5. It was a mathematical certainty. The pumps were useless. The Iron Giant was bleeding to death. Andrews looked at the captain and gave him the sentence. "She is going to sink, Captain. And we don't have enough boats." Midnight. Down below, the ocean was roaring in. The mailroom was flooding. The squash court was underwater. The firemen in the boiler rooms were fighting a losing battle against the Atlantic. In third class, panic began to spread. These were the immigrants stored in the belly of the ship. Many didn't speak English. They woke up to the sound of water rushing under their doors. But when they tried to go up, they found the gates locked. Under American immigration laws, third-class passengers were to be kept separate from the clean people in first and second class. Even as the ship was sinking, stewards followed orders. They kept the gates locked. They were trapped in a steel cage watching the water rise, while above them, the rich were putting on their life jackets. Up on deck, it was surreal. The band was playing ragtime, the lights were blazing. There was no sense of urgency. And then, the lifeboats started to leave. Lifeboat number 7. Capacity, 65 people. It left with only 28. Why? Because they didn't believe the ship was sinking. They thought the lifeboats were safer than the ocean, but less safe than the unsinkable Titanic. They chose the warmth of the deck over the cold, dark sea. A fatal mistake. 1 a.m. The bow was sinking deeper. The stern was rising. The angle of the deck was getting steeper. The illusion of safety was shattering. The cage doors were finally opened, but it was too late. The mathematics of hubris had already decided who would live and who would die.
2:15 a.m. The angle became impossible. Gravity took over.
Inside the ship, heavy machinery tore loose. Pianos, furniture, and crates crashed through walls like avalanches. On deck, it was pandemonium. The first funnel collapsed, crushing swimmers in the water. The unsinkable ship was groaning in pain. The steel was being twisted beyond its breaking point. And then, the end of civilization. For 2 hours, the lights had stayed on, keeping the terror at bay. But at 2:18, the electrical system failed. Blink, and they were gone. 1,500 people were suddenly plunged into total, absolute darkness. In the middle of the Atlantic, the only light came from the stars and the sparks of the ship tearing itself apart. Then came the sound. Survivors described it as explosions. It wasn't an explosion. It was the ship's spine snapping. The Titanic broke in two. The heavy engines dragged the bow down, tearing the ship apart right through the grand staircase. The stern crashed back onto the water, crushing anyone underneath it. For a moment, the stern stood vertical, like a tombstone marking its own grave. And then, it began to slide. Faster and faster, an elevator to the bottom. At 2:20 a.m., the RMS Titanic vanished. The Queen of the Ocean was gone.
At 2:20 a.m., the ship was gone.
But the horror had just begun. 1,500 people were floating in the freezing Atlantic. Survivors in the lifeboats described the sound as a giant swarm of bees or a stadium cheering. It was a chorus of 1,500 voices screaming for help in the dark. They weren't drowning, they were freezing to death. The water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius. Salt water doesn't freeze at 32, it gets colder. It was liquid ice. At that temperature, the human body goes into shock. Blood rushes away from your arms and legs to protect your heart. You lose the ability to move. You lose consciousness in 15 minutes. Death follows soon after. The lifeboats were half empty. They were only a few hundred yards away. They heard the screams, but fear paralyzed them. They were afraid the swimmers would swamp the boats, so they waited. And slowly, the noise faded. The screaming stopped. The moaning stopped. By 2:40 a.m., 20 minutes after the ship sank, the Atlantic became silent again. When the sun rose, it shone down on a floating graveyard. Titanic was not just a shipwreck. It was the end of an era of optimism. We built a steel giant and said even God couldn't sink it. Nature heard us and taught us a brutal lesson in humility. The wreck still lies down there, in the crushing darkness. A rusticle-covered monument to human arrogance. Subscribe to Epochlight to remember the lessons history taught us in blood and ice.